Welcome back, everyone. We have a very exciting afternoon planned. So if you've had lunch and you're revved up, you've got some caffeine, here we go. We decided we would start right after lunch with tax fraud. So my good friend Vic Fleischer from UC Irvine, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Frank. I'm Vic Fleischer. I'm a law professor at UC Irvine. And I am thrilled to have with me today Carrie Larson from the Department of Justice, Tax Division, where she is Senior Litigation Counsel. Carrie went to the University of Chicago and University of Washington Law School, and worked at Latham and Watkins for 5-ish years before working for the government. You moved to DOJ in 2009. And on the end, we have Jesse Eisinger from ProPublica. Jesse, like me, went to Columbia College, go Lions. And then the
winless in my time there.
Mine as well. Jesse worked for a variety of news organizations, including the Wall Street Journal, where he won a Pulitzer for national reporting in 2011. His first book, The Chicken Shit Club, always fun to say, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives, was published in 2017, and you've been working in recent years for ProPublica. And of particular interest for this panel, ProPublica has done a lot of tax reporting in recent years, including a series on gutting the IRS. And so, Jesse, I wonder if we could start with you telling us a little bit about that series and what you and your colleagues reported.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks to Frank and everyone for having me. I don't know what kind of sadist would put a tax panel right after lunch, but we will try to keep you awake.
That kind there.
Yeah. The hoary joke about the fraud center is that it's not a how-to, but many people have treated our tax series as a how-to. The Wall Street Journal did actually, we published a story earlier last year about Peter Thiel's secret $5 billion Roth IRA, and we felt like that was kind of outrageous, and the Wall Street Journal wrote a story about how you too could have a Roth IRA that was like this. So, and the reason why it's how-to is that there's never been a time since the IRS has existed that is better to commit tax fraud. And the reason is that the IRS has been gutted. And it was a series of stories that my colleague Paul Keel and I did in 2018 about the devastation of the IRS and trying to come to grips with the full scale of it. But I'll give you a very quick summary and then we can go into it. The budget is down in real dollars about $2 billion. And there's been a little bit of increase since the Democrats took over Congress, but really is just kind of stanched the bleeding, so there's not in decline, but the enforcement budget continues to go down. Revenue agents, those are the auditors, they're fewer, they're a little over 8,000 right now. That is fewer in number since any time since World War II. It keeps, the era keeps getting earlier and earlier. When we wrote our story, it was since the year that Stalin had died, which I think was 53, but now it's actually continues to decline. And they've stanched the bleeding there a little bit, but not actually that much, because they're employing other people in various areas, because the IRS has been thrown huge responsibilities to administer Obamacare and then to administer COVID checks, and so they're being overwhelmed with new responsibilities as fewer and fewer employees are assigned to do audits. Tens of thousands of employees have left over the last decade, and audits are plummeting. particularly of large corporations and the wealthy. So it used to be that large corporations were audited, actually more than 100% of large corporations were audited every year, because most large corporations were, or frequently large corporations were under audit for multiple years running. Now it's down to about 50% of large corporations are audited every year, and that overstates things because the audits are thinner. Thinner and less, there are fewer staffers and they look at fewer issues. And audits of the wealthy have collapsed. So audits of the ultra wealthy and the mass affluent, or the affluent, are down about 80%. Roughly. Again, it's the same thing. Yes, this is, I see Corey cheering, but Corey is the only one here who's probably a pretender to the affluent class, as opposed to many others here in this room. But that again overstates things because the audits are thinner. And the expertise is being drained out of the agency. And so the result is that, as I say, it's a fabulous time to be a tax cheat. And we are on, this to me is one of the great governance crises of our moment, a kind of underappreciated attack on the administrative state that has been largely perpetrated by Republicans starting in 2010, but going back several decades, to attack the tax collection abilities of the United States. And I've said this many times, so I'm repeating myself if people are tired of this spiel, but a lot of people are worried about the fragility of the American democracy. And before you have a democracy, you have to have a functioning government, a functioning society. And if you don't have a functioning tax collection system, you are on the brink of not having a functioning tax government or society. And I think we are flirting with that kind of crisis without really appreciating it.
I know I write a lot about the taxation of hedge funds and private equity funds, and the audit rate of partnerships is down to, I think, 0.3% of partnerships get audited. So that has an effect. Some of it is out and out tax fraud, but there's also a lot of just aggressive tax positions that people are willing to take because they're playing the audit lottery, and it's unlikely that their number is going to come up. And so my sense is that the private sector is more willing to take aggressive positions than maybe would have been the case when I was coming out of school 25 years ago. So Carrie, why don't we turn to you? Why don't you start us off telling us a little bit about what you do at DOJ, and then we can go from there.
Okay. I want to first say what I'm saying here today is my own personal view. I am not speaking on behalf of the United States, on behalf of the IRS or the Department of Justice, now that I have that out of the way and didn't forget to say it. So tax division, we only handle things that come to us from the IRS. So as you can imagine from what Jesse said, if the IRS is gutted, what that effect might have on our cases. I work in the civil side. We handle all civil tax litigation in district court, bankruptcy court, state court, and our criminal side oversees all criminal tax prosecutions. All grand juries that are authorized have to go through our criminal side. And the whole purpose there of having it centralized in that way, and I should say a number of the criminal tax cases are handled by U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the country, but our criminal people do handle some. They provide expertise and again, the coordination aspect. But the mission is to ensure that our country's tax laws are enforced consistently and equitably and fairly. That said, I can't speak to what is going on at the IRS in terms of audits, what issues they're looking at, things like that. We just see the after effects in terms of either suits brought by large corporations who've taken aggressive positions on a transaction and they're seeking a refund, or a position where a taxpayer previously treated an item a certain way, but then a number of other corporations have started to file refund suits, and so everyone jumps on the bandwagon. We handled those. We also do, on the civil side, we do injunctive work, and so we bring suits against tax shelter promoters. It's been going on, I would say, for probably the last 25 years. And in listening to the journalist panel, in the early 2000s, and I actually started at the tax division right out of law school, and then I went to Latham, and then I came back. But in the early 2000s, when the injunction work was really getting started again, there was a reporter at the New York Times that covered a lot of this litigation. And, it's not the high profile, accounting firms. These are the lower, everyday shelter promoters, return preparers, but by going after, the folks that have the broadest reach, that's one really effective way of using what limited resources we have to have a bigger impact.
Were those mostly individuals, or were these corporate shelters?
Those were mostly individuals. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My sense is that the corporate tax shelters of the late 90s, early aughts, that most of that has calmed down with Sarbanes-Oxley and other things that have made it harder to use those shelters. Is that your impression?
I don't have any shelters right now that I'm working. How about that?
So I'm curious about the cases that don't get to you. So we might talk a little bit more about, there's a sense that sometimes the government is outmatched, and I want to come back to that. But before we get to that, and my sense is the DOJ's track record is actually really good when the cases get to you. But they have to get to you, and they have to be found. So Jesse, maybe can you tell us a little bit more about your impression of what cases are not making it to the Department of Justice so that they can either prosecute criminally or pursue civil actions?
Sure, and I think that there are, one of the things that I felt very strongly and was very gratified by in reporting on the IRS. We talked to hundreds of current and former IRS people, and I've talked to many, many prosecutors in my time. I wrote a book on this, free plug here. But they're enormously capable people. So it's not about not having intelligent, dedicated public servants. It's really about resources and leadership at the top. But one of the things that Paul and I wrote about several years ago, and I think it's only been amplified since, is that the character of the tax crimes that the IRS refers to and works with the DOJ has completely changed. So the kind of criminal tax cases really has dramatically changed, and the major change is that prosecutions of tax fraud based on legal income, so you're not breaking the law to make money, but you're cheating on your taxes, have collapsed. And what the IRS does mostly, and what the DOJ does mostly, is kind of attach themselves now to cases where there's a tax fraud element in an otherwise criminal case, like a money laundering case or a drug case, something like that. And then they do the tax portion of it, and they have this expertise, and they're very welcome. And sometimes the tax element is a little bit easier to prove than the cartel element or the money laundering element, and because there's some overseas aspect of it, and it's too far, it's distant for the prosecutors, and so they're very welcome. So there's a kind of synergy there, but that's a terrible outcome for American society, because it's very important to prosecute drug crime, and it's important to prosecute money laundering, but you also have to have an enormously robust criminal and civil prosecutorial effort for tax evasion. And then there's a huge amount of what you just referred to as playing the audit lottery or going, and we just don't know. We can't quantify it. But Justin Elliott and I and Paul Keel and Jeff Ernshausen just wrote a big story about Jeff Yass in Susquehanna. And Jeff Yass is one of the highest earning Americans. We have his tax record, so we reported about his income. He's much, much wealthier than the Forbes estimate, which puts it at about $12 billion, but he's probably worth possibly, many multiples of that, at least 3 or 4 multiples of that. Susquehanna is a sprawling financial firm. Many of you will be familiar with it, and he pays half the tax rate that his peers pay. And the mechanism for that is a partnership. One of the key aspects is a partnership. Partnerships don't get audited. You have a better chance of getting struck by lightning, as Ron Wyden says, than getting audited in a partnership. And what he was doing was a complex trade, it looks like, that is called in the lingo a non-straddle straddle, where he's buying and selling the same stock or very, very similar stock, and taking the tax loss, selling, trying to arbitrage the difference between long-term capital gains and short-term capital gains. That is the kind of extremely aggressive type of move that the IRS either is looking at and can't bring, tries to challenge and is unsuccessful, or throws up its hands because they don't have the resources and the time and the leadership to go after that.
Yeah, I remember in practice one of my colleagues saying, if we didn't have the straddle rules, the income tax is simply optional. And if you don't, I guess the next step of that is if you don't enforce the straddle rules, the income tax is optional.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think from the policy side, we often wonder if there is enough human capital on the enforcement side, enough folks who know what's going on, who have the ability to unravel these things. And one of the stories I thought was really interesting was the what I think of as the SEAL Team 6 story, where the IRS put together a special team with the knowledge to try and go after these complicated transactions that would take a dedicated deep dive on behalf of the government. Why don't you tell us how that worked out?
Yeah, this is called the Global High Wealth Group, and it was formed around 2009, and it was, the IRS knew that it didn't audit the ultra-high net worth individuals as well as it should be. So it's a completely obvious problem that they fully recognize. And the essential problem was that they were looking at one return, or the way they would audit is they would pick out one return and start to look at that. And the revelation was that ultra high net worth billionaires look more like major corporations, and they have sprawling empires with multiple returns for partnerships and individual returns, and that they're broad, and they have philanthropic efforts, and everything is kind of working together to reduce their taxes. And so they realize, well, we have to take a holistic approach, and we can't just lock one person in a room. We have to have multiple people looking at this. And it's kind of stunning that it took them that long to have this series of revelations, but finally they have this series of very obvious observations about their inability to audit high worth individuals, and they set up this team right into the Republican takeover of Congress and the budget cuts in 2010. So they announced this with great fanfare. The current commissioner, Charles Rettig, who was appointed by Trump, was then a a lawyer for high net worth individuals doing this kind of tax controversy work and audit work, and he trumpets this as the audits from hell. So there's a lot of fanfare and a lot of hype, but in fact, it's just a bust from the get-go. They can't recruit enough people. They don't have enough expertise, and there is an effort. A huge, enormous effort from law firms and accounting firms to attack the idea of it at the very beginning, both saying that the IRS doesn't have the expertise to do it, they don't know what they're doing when they're looking at things, they're asking the wrong questions, and that it's intrusive. And so that's quite a successful effort. The IRS ends up feeling very sheepish about asking ultra net worth people for too much information. They feel like that they're violating their precious privacy. And by the end, it's just a total bust. And we walked through the capitulation in one case of a German billionaire who named Georg Schaeffler. The Schaeffler family was not helpful for my story, but they were quite expert at avoiding American taxes to the tune of billions of dollars, and argued that a debt forgiveness was not a debt forgiveness. And finally, the IRS threw up its hands, and a guy that should have owed possibly over $1 billion in taxes ended up sort of settling for pennies on the dollar, tens of millions.
So, Carrie, tell me a little bit more about what happens from the time that you have IRS agents in the field, they come across something, and they audit the transaction or transactions. What happens between then and how it gets to you?
Well, it depends on the degree of, I guess, fraud, for lack of a better word. So it could just be a run-of-the-mill civil exam where someone has underreported their income, or taken an aggressive deduction, or a corporation has done the equivalent, but magnified by millions of dollars. If there is oftentimes, like if there's an outside party that is promoting a transaction and it's hitting a lot of taxpayers, or it's popping up in a lot of exams, it might be referred to CI, criminal investigation, which is the other part of the IRS. I think the numbers are much smaller. Oh, and I'll just throw out this pitch is DOJ just got done, tax division just got done hiring lateral attorneys, but I think we're going to be doing another round of lateral attorney hiring. It's one of the greatest places to work if you want in-court experience, and you're working on some of the top tax cases in the country. So, and the IRS is also hiring CI agents, revenue officers, which they do the collection work, revenue agents, they go out and do the exams, and then Irs Appeals and any number of other technical positions within. So, but matters may go over to the criminal side. If they do, they'll be assigned, there's oversight. I am not as familiar, so I don't want to misspeak on this, but typically a report will be prepared that's then approved, sent over to the tax division, and only then might a grand jury be convened. It might be handled by the tax division in DC, it might be handled by a US Attorney's Office. It could be that we end up with a civil case and we see through discovery, because the IRS exam, they gather a certain amount of information to support the tax assessment or the additional tax that they're suggesting is owed. But if we're going to litigate a case, that's a very different set of support that we're looking for. I mean, we're looking for contemporaneous documents, we're looking for all kinds of witnesses, both within the entity, outside the entity, and when you put together that matrix of all of this conflicting evidence that the IRS didn't gather, but we now have it at our disposal to put in front of a court. It can be fun. So, yeah. And we do sometimes civil side, we can refer things to CI as well.
So one step in the middle there that I want to talk about a little bit is the Irs Appeals, which I am hearing from friends sometimes that it's sort of like the taxpayer has multiple fronts on which they can try and engage in battle. And so sometimes if it's not going so well with the auditors, they can sort of strategically employ the Irs Appeals process to try and move things in a different direction. So Jesse, I think this is something that you've also reported on.
Yeah, this is a completely fascinating aspect of the IRS that's really unknown outside of tax experts. There's essentially what I kind of think of within the IRS as a fifth column that is anti-tax collection. And it's the appeals division within the IRS. And I'm being a little mean to them, but internally they're nicknamed the gift shop, because it's a process where if the taxpayer is having a problem with the IRS before they fight it out in court, and the tax system has its own court, and the tax court, and the tax court is much less public than regular court because nothing is electronic, and you have to go get tax filings, physical documents, and physically go to the place, and it's all extremely difficult to obtain these documents. It's gotten slightly better in the last year or so, but within the IRS, out of the public eye, is an appeals process, and the appeals process is extremely risk averse and very worried about litigation risk and losing. And purportedly because if you lose, you could have a cascading effect because you create bad law. And whenever the IRS loses, that has this amplification effect because the IRS Appeals Office then jacks up the risks of litigation. And when you jack up the risks of litigation and you jack up the risks that the government will lose, then you settle for less and less and less. And so it's called the gift shop because you can go to the appeals office and rant about the unfairness of the audit. And the stunning aspect of this is that the IRS the agents don't have the right to speak to the appeals office. So it's a one-sided sort of hearing where the IRS speaks, the appeals office only speaks to the taxpayer and the taxpayer's representatives and doesn't hear the rebuttal from the tax agency itself, from the auditors itself. It's mind-blowing. So
it's supposed to be adversarial, but in a sense it's not.
I mean, I guess it's supposed to be adversarial because the appeals office is within the IRS. So there's a presumption that they would be on the same side, but in fact, they're looking to settle. And the facts are that they do settle for pennies on the dollar. They don't really release much information on what the settlements are, but from what we understand, it's pennies on the dollar with great frequency. So this is one of these kind of secrets of the tax world that the public doesn't have any understanding of.
Carrie, is that something where the IRS Appeals, do they talk to DOJ about the strength of the case? And if this goes to court, what's going to happen?
Jesse's correct. I mean, Irs Appeals, they are not permitted to speak with others outside. I mean, there are a few limited circumstances where, if a taxpayer presents new evidence, new arguments, there may be circumstances where the appeals officer is supposed to get in touch with the exam team. But generally speaking, I was in private practice. We did our fair share of visits to Irs Appeals, and I mean, frankly, it wasn't something that I enjoyed because well, for the reasons that you're concerned about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like stomping on an ant. Doesn't give you that much pleasure.
Yeah.
Oh, also, I don't think that they're lawyers, right? They're generally not lawyers, so they're opining on litigation, non-lawyers opining on litigation risk.
Yeah, they aren't lawyers. They don't handle cases in court. They're not necessarily in communication with people that handle cases in district court. But that said, I mean, of the ones that I have interacted with, there are some incredibly smart, incredibly hardworking people at Irs Appeals.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I just think it's like as if the Wall Street Journal editorial page designed a tax system for the wealthy.
Well, I guess I'll try to end on a slightly more positive note. The Democrats in Congress are interested in getting more money to the IRS, and Natasha Sarin at the White House or at Treasury is heading up that effort to try and provide more adequate resources. As a policy person, I'm still concerned about some of the institutional barriers or challenges that can make it hard, but at least increasing the funding, I think, is a good start. And we're out of time, so let's thank Jesse and Carrie for their panel today.